He defended his daughter from a gang of hooligans in the subway. The video went viral, and the next day his life changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The garage smelled of oil and metal, the kind of scent that clung to a man's clothes no matter how many times he tried to wash it out. The faint hiss of an air compressor lingered in the background, and the floor was coated in a permanent gray dust from years of work boots and spilled coolant. Mark Ellison stood bent over the hood of an old sedan, his hands moving with steady precision, the kind of motion that was half habit, half muscle memory. His coveralls were smudged and torn at the knees, his knuckles scraped from the day's earlier repairs. He didn't complain. Work like this was survival, and survival was something he understood better than most. The world outside the garage was busy with noise and traffic, but inside it was his domain. The clang of a dropped wrench, the pop of a socket loosening, the metallic thud of a car door closing, it was a rhythm he had come to rely on. Years ago, the sound of a helicopter rotor or the bark of distant gunfire had been what kept him grounded, but that was another life. He preferred the garage now, its predictable mess, its honest labor. The day moved on, the light shifting from bright morning to the flat, dull shade of evening, and still Mark kept at it, finishing one repair, moving to the next. When the last car of the day was driven off by a grateful owner, the garage finally fell silent. In the corner of his small office, on a dusty shelf above the desk, where he kept invoices and parts catalogs, there was a metal box. Inside were medals, commendations, a few photographs of men he had once served with. He rarely opened it. Tonight, as he locked up, his eyes lingered on the box, then drifted to the old limp in his right leg. The pain was always worse when it rained. And tonight the air was damp. The memory of how he had gotten that limp flashed briefly. A roadside explosion, the sound of screaming, the smell of burning rubber. He turned off the light and stepped outside before the memory could deepen. Home was a small apartment several blocks away. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and it was theirs. The paint was peeling in places, and the furniture was secondhand, but the kitchen table was always neat, and the air smelled faintly of laundry soap. Lila sat at the table, her legs swinging as she worked through her math homework, a pencil clutched in one small hand. She looked up when he came in, her face brightening. Mark's shoulders relaxed a little as he set his tools down and went to wash his hands. The day's grease swirled dark in the sink as he scrubbed. When he joined her at the table, he found she had already set out 2 plates, one for him, one for her, and the simple meal he had left simmering was ready to be served. They ate quietly, as they usually did, the noise of the city drifting in from the window. Lila told him about her drawing class, about the picture she was working on of a tree with roots stretching deep into the ground. He nodded, listening, though part of his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the next day's jobs at the garage, about the overdue rent notice sitting folded in the drawer, about how badly Lila needed new shoes before school started again. When they were done, she proudly showed him the drawing she had finished that afternoon, a sketch of him standing tall, looking like some sort of superhero. Mark felt something catch in his chest. He managed a smile, though there was a tightness behind it. He tucked her into bed a little later, smoothing the blanket over her small frame, and for a while he just sat there, watching her breathe. She was the reason he kept going, the reason he stayed out of trouble and tried to keep his temper in check. The neighborhood around their building was not a place where you wanted to linger after dark. The streets were cracked and littered with bottles and trash, and the alleyways smelled of damp concrete and old cigarettes. Sometimes Mark would catch sight of teenagers hanging around near the corner store, passing something between them in brown paper bags, their laughter sharp and mocking. He never intervened. Never said a word, not unless they came too close to Lila. Keeping his head down was the safest thing. He had been trained to act decisively, but he had also been trained to know when to wait, and this was a life that required patience. The following evening was just another in their long routine. Mark left the garage later than usual, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his coveralls. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, the last light of day fading as he hurried home to collect Lila. She was already waiting by the door with her small backpack, eager to get to her art class. They walked together through the neighborhood, her chatter filling the quiet as he kept his eyes on every shadow. After class, they headed for the subway. The entrance smelled faintly of wet stone and metal, the air cooler underground. The platform was sparsely populated, a man in a suit scrolling on his phone, a woman with a stroller, a group of tired workers leaning against a pillar. Mark positioned himself near the edge, but far enough back to keep Lila safe. When the train came roaring into the station, he guided her inside and found a pair of seats. She settled against him, clutching her sketchbook, her eyes drooping from the long day. The rhythmic clatter of the train over the tracks was oddly soothing, and for a moment, Mark let himself breathe. He didn't notice right away when the atmosphere in the car shifted. The first clue was the sudden bark of laughter from the far end, loud and jarring. Then came the sound of sneakers squeaking on the floor, the scuff of someone kicking a seat. Mark's senses sharpened, the old instincts sliding into place. He looked up and saw them, a group of teenagers, maybe 4 or 5, entering the car at the last station, their phones out, their faces lit by the screens as they filmed each other. They were laughing too loudly, shoving each other, looking for trouble. Mark's jaw tightened. He glanced at Lila, who had stirred at the noise, and shifted her a little closer to him. The train rumbled on, the teenagers' voices rising over the sound. Mark kept his expression neutral, but every muscle in his body had gone tense. He had been in enough hostile rooms to know when the temperature was rising, when a situation was heading toward a point of no return. He had no way of knowing that this night would not end like the others, that what was about to happen would not only shatter the quiet life he had built, but would also set in motion a chain of events that would change him forever. The sound of laughter at the far end of the train was like the snap of a branch in a silent forest, small, sharp, but enough to set every nerve in Mark's body on alert. The group of teenagers moved down the car, their sneakers slapping against the floor, the glow of their phones casting strange reflections on the windows. Their voices were high with the careless energy of the young, that reckless kind of boldness that came from knowing there would be no consequences. Mark shifted slightly in his seat, placing his body between them and Lila. She had opened her eyes fully now, sensing something was wrong, her small hands clutching the sketchbook tighter against her chest. The teenagers took their time, brushing past passengers, knocking shoulders deliberately as they passed. Some of the riders averted their eyes, staring fixedly at the advertisements above the seats, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. Mark's eyes tracked their movements carefully, his mind already running through scenarios, counting how many there were, where the exits were, what could be used as cover if it came to that. His pulse stayed even, but he could feel the familiar hum of readiness building under his skin. They stopped halfway down the car, one of them leaning casually against the pole as he scanned the rows of passengers. Another one snickered, pulling out something from his pocket, a lighter, and flicked it on and off just to watch the spark. Then the comments started. At first they were just words tossed into the air, bait cast out to see who would react. An older man lowered his head. The woman with the stroller turned her body to shield her child. No one wanted trouble. When no one bit, the teenagers got bolder. They started to move again, this time in a pack, laughing louder, throwing curses at the empty air. Mark felt Lila press closer to him, her shoulder against his side. He kept his gaze forward, calm but watchful. Then one of them reached out as they passed and gave the edge of her backpack a tug. The motion was quick, almost playful, but Mark saw the way her eyes widened in alarm, and that was enough. He reached out, his hand closing firmly around the strap before it could be yanked away, and looked up at the boy with a flat, unreadable expression. For a split second, there was silence. Then the ringleader laughed, a hard sound, and muttered something to the others. Phones were raised, the cameras now pointing at Mark and Lila. This was what they had wanted all along, a reaction, something to film and share, proof that they could dominate a stranger in public. Mark knew he had only a few heartbeats to decide. Years of training compressed the moment into something sharp and clear. He could see every detail, the distance between himself and each boy, the weight distribution in their stances, the pull near his left shoulder that could be used for leverage. He could smell the faint trace of cheap beer on their breath, the sour edge of adrenaline. He moved Lila gently but firmly behind him, his hand steady on her shoulder, his body now a shield. The first boy moved in closer, grinning as if he had already won, his phone aimed directly at Mark's face. Mark rose to his feet slowly, deliberately, his height forcing the boy to take a half step back. The air in the car seemed to thin. The attack, when it came, was sloppy and impulsive, just as Mark had expected. The boy lunged forward, trying to shove him, maybe hoping to get it all on video. But Mark's response was faster than the camera could catch. He sidestepped, grabbed the boy's wrist, and twisted, the motion smooth and efficient. In less than a second, the boy was face down against the side of the seat, his phone clattering to the floor. The others shouted, but Mark was already moving. The next one came at him, arm raised, and Mark ducked under the swing, driving his shoulder into the attacker's midsection and sending him sprawling onto the floor. Another grabbed at his jacket from behind, and Mark pivoted, hooking a leg and using the boy's momentum to drop him onto his back with a thud that echoed through the car. It was over in seconds. The leader scrambled back, clutching his wrist, his expression a mixture of pain and shock. The others, wide-eyed and humiliated, scrambled to their feet. None of them wanted to try again. The train was slowing as it approached the next station, and the moment the doors slid open, they bolted out into the platform, leaving behind the echo of their retreating footsteps and the scattered murmurs of the passengers. Mark stooped, picked up Lila's backpack, and checked quickly to make sure she was unharmed. She stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, but she wasn't crying. He handed her the bag and motioned for her to sit. Around them, the passengers were silent. Some stared, others kept their heads down. A man at the far end of the car still had his phone out, recording, his face unreadable. Mark lowered himself back into the seat, his breathing steady but his body still coiled tight. He could feel the eyes on him, could feel the judgment, the awe, maybe even the fear. He didn't care. His only concern was the small girl beside him, who now leaned against him and closed her eyes, her trust in him absolute. The train continued on, the rhythm of the tracks returning to its usual monotonous clatter. Mark's mind, however, was anything but calm. He knew this wouldn't stay private. Someone would upload the video before the night was over, and by morning, strangers would know his face, his name, maybe even his past. He had spent years trying to live quietly, to be just another man in a working-class neighborhood. Tonight, that life had cracked open, and there would be no putting it back the way it was. When they finally stepped off at their stop, Mark carried himself with the same calm stride as always. But inside, he was still burning with the leftover charge of action. The streets outside smelled of damp concrete and old rain. He walked Lila home in silence, his eyes sweeping the shadows automatically. The way they always had, back when he was a soldier, moving through dangerous territory. At home, he helped her get ready for bed, watched as she climbed beneath the blanket with her sketchbook clutched tight to her chest. She didn't say anything about what had happened, but her silence said enough. When she finally drifted off to sleep, Mark stood in the doorway for a long time, staring into the dark room. He had protected her tonight, but the world outside was still the same. Unpredictable, violent, hungry for spectacle. Later, when the apartment was silent and the city outside had gone to sleep, Mark sat at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee. The adrenaline had faded, leaving him feeling hollow, but strangely awake. He knew there would be a price for what had happened in the subway. There always was. And deep down, beneath the tiredness and the worry, there was something else. A part of him that had felt alive again for the first time in years. By morning, the video had already made its way across half the city. Mark found out when his phone buzzed endlessly on the nightstand, waking him earlier than usual. The screen was filled with notifications, messages from people he barely knew, links to social media posts, even a few missed calls. At first, he didn't open any of them, staring at the glow of the screen with a dull sense of dread. Then, with a resigned swipe, he clicked one of the links. There he was on the screen, grainy but unmistakable. Rising from his seat in the subway car, the teenager's arm twisting in his grip, the other scattering like startled birds. The caption read, "Mechanic takes down gang in 10 seconds. The comments were already piling up, some praising him, some debating whether he had gone too far. Mark sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the early light filtering through the curtains. This wasn't how he had wanted the world to see him. For years he had kept his head down, just another man with grease-stained hands trying to pay rent. Now he was something else, a story people shared with their morning coffee. Lila padded sleepily into the room, rubbing her eyes. She hadn't asked him about the incident the night before, but she had clearly been thinking about it. She climbed onto the bed beside him and leaned against his arm, quiet. Mark put the phone away and kissed the top of her head. Whatever happened next, he would shield her from as much of it as he could. At the garage, the day felt different. The first customer of the morning shook his hand a little too firmly, his smile wide and knowing. "Saw you online," he said, as if congratulating him. Mark nodded, gave a polite smile, and got back to work. But as the hours went on, more people stopped by, not all of them with cars to fix. Some came just to see him, to tell him they were proud someone had stood up to those kids. Others wanted details, wanted to know if he had been in the military, wanted to take pictures with him in front of their cars. By lunchtime, Mark was exhausted, not from the work, but from the attention, the eyes on him. The constant questions. It was a different kind of pressure than he was used to. In the military, when people looked at him, it had been with expectation and trust. This was different. This was curiosity mixed with voyeurism, the fascination of a public who had nothing invested in the man himself, only in the story he represented. That night, after Lila was asleep, Mark sat alone in the kitchen. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the look on her face during the fight. Not just fear, but something else. Something like awe. He didn't want her to think that this was what strength always looked like, that violence was the first answer. He remembered his training, the long hours spent learning not just how to strike, but when not to. Control had been the most valuable lesson. The following day, 2 officers came by the garage. They were polite, professional, and their questions were straightforward. They had seen the video, of course. Everyone had. They asked him to explain what had happened in his own words, and he did, plainly and without embellishment. When they left, one of them gave him a look that was somewhere between respect and warning. as if to say, "Be careful. People are watching now." The days passed, but the video didn't go away. More angles surfaced as other passengers uploaded their clips. A local news station ran a segment calling him the subway mechanic, and a talk show debated whether he was a hero or a vigilante. Mark ignored as much of it as he could, keeping his head down and focusing on work. Then, one evening as he was closing the garage, a woman approached him. She was neatly dressed, carrying a clipboard and a business card. She introduced herself as the director of a nearby youth center. She had seen the video, of course. Everyone had. And she wasn't there to congratulate him. She was there to offer him something. She explained that the center had been trying to reach kids like the ones on the train for years. They ran after-school programs, sports leagues, mentorship sessions. But what they lacked was someone who could command real respect. Someone who could teach discipline, not from a book, but from experience. She believed Mark could be that person. The offer took him by surprise. He wasn't a teacher, wasn't a counselor. He was a man who fixed engines and tried to raise his daughter without screwing up too badly. But the director was insistent. She told him he had already shown those boys something they wouldn't forget. Not just strength, but control. She wanted him to come to the center, to run classes on self-defense, maybe even mentorship sessions. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat at the table again, staring at the wall as the clock ticked. The idea of standing in front of a group of teenagers, trying to reach them, made him uneasy. It wasn't just the responsibility. It was the risk of opening up parts of himself he had kept buried for so long. Still, the memory of that night in the subway replayed in his mind. He remembered the wild look in the ringleader's eyes. The way the others had scattered, the tense silence that had followed. If someone didn't reach kids like that, they would keep going down the same road until someone got seriously hurt. Or worse. When he checked on Lila before bed, she was curled up with her sketchbook, asleep. Another drawing lay on the floor beside her bed. This one was of him again, standing tall, his arms out like a shield, her small figure behind him. Something inside him tightened. By the end of the week, he found himself walking to the address the director had given him. The building was old but well kept, the sound of bouncing basketballs echoing from a gym inside. Through the window, he saw a group of teenagers clustered around a table, laughing, shoving each other lightly, not unlike the boys from the subway. Mark stood outside for a long time before going in. He wasn't sure what he would say or what he could offer, but he knew one thing. If he walked away now, he would regret it. The youth center smelled faintly of floor polish and chalk dust. The sound of sneakers squeaking on the gym floor echoed down the hall as Mark stepped inside, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. The director greeted him warmly and led him through the building, but Mark hardly heard her words. His mind was fixed on the group of teenagers in the gym, the noise of their laughter spilling out through the open doorway. They reminded him too much of the boys from the train, not the same faces, but the same restless energy, the same aimless hunger for challenge. He stood for a moment in the doorway, watching them shoot hoops and shove one another playfully, and felt something old and uneasy rise in his chest. The first class was small, 7 boys and 2 girls, all of them curious but guarded, sitting in a half circle on the mats. Some of them clearly recognized him from the videos. Their faces lit with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Others looked bored, as if they'd been forced to attend and were just waiting for an excuse to tune out. Mark knelt on the mat in front of them and introduced himself, his voice calm, his movements measured. He didn't tell them much about his past, just enough to make them understand that he knew what he was talking about when it came to defending yourself. He started simple. He showed them how to stand, how to keep their feet planted so they wouldn't be knocked over easily. He taught them how to break a fall without getting hurt, how to keep their hands up to protect their faces. At first they giggled, imitating his stance in exaggerated ways, but he didn't scold them. He corrected them patiently, demonstrating again and again until their movements grew smoother. By the end of the hour, they were sweating, breathing hard, but their eyes were bright. Over the next few weeks, the classes grew. Word had spread quickly. The subway mechanic was teaching at the youth center, and kids who had never cared about discipline or practice before were suddenly showing up early just to watch. Mark found himself working harder than he had in years, staying late to plan drills, cleaning the mats afterward, making sure the equipment was safe. Each time he walked into the room, the noise level dropped a little faster. They were starting to respect him, not because of the viral video, but because he showed up every time and treated them seriously. At night, when he returned home, he felt different. The exhaustion was still there, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from knowing the day had been worth something. Lila would be waiting at the table with her drawings spread out, eager to show him the newest one. More and more often, they were pictures of the gym, of him standing in the center surrounded by the kids, his hands lifted in instruction. Seeing them made something warm settle in his chest. There were moments when it was hard. Some of the teenagers resisted, testing him with smart remarks or lazy effort. But Mark never raised his voice, never lost control. When one boy tried to start a fight during class, Mark stopped him with a single, perfectly timed move that put the boy on the mat before he even realized what had happened. Instead of shouting, Mark helped him up, looked him in the eye, and simply told him to try again. The boy did, and from that day on, he was the first one on the mat at every session. As the months passed, Mark began to notice small changes. The same kids who had come in loud and restless were now standing straighter, speaking more respectfully, even helping each other pick up equipment after class. Some of them started coming early just to talk, to ask questions about life, about choices. Mark found himself sharing pieces of wisdom he hadn't realized he had carried with him, lessons about patience, about knowing when to walk away from a fight, about the importance of protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. One evening, after the last class had ended and the gym was quiet, Mark sat alone on the mat, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The building was nearly empty, the sun just beginning to set outside the high windows. He thought about the man he had been when this all started, just a mechanic trying to keep his head down, to keep the world from intruding too much on the small, fragile life he had built for himself and his daughter. That man had been tired, closed off, weighed down by a past he didn't talk about. Now, though, he felt something different. The past was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing him into the ground. It felt like a foundation, something he could build on. He thought of the boys from the train and wondered where they were now. Maybe they had seen the news stories. Maybe they had heard that the man they tried to humiliate was teaching kids like them how to fight without destroying themselves. As he locked up the center that night and stepped outside, the air was cool and clear. The city lights flickered on one by one, and for once he didn't feel the need to rush home. He walked slowly, letting the evening settle around him. He passed a group of teenagers on the corner, not his students, not the ones from the train, just another bunch of kids with too much energy and nowhere to put it. And he didn't tense up. He just nodded at them as he walked by. They nodded back. When he reached his apartment, Lila was waiting by the window. She ran to meet him at the door, her hair messy from playing, her face lit up. Mark scooped her up and spun her once before setting her down, and she laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. They sat together at the table while she showed him another drawing, this one of him smiling. He realized, with a start, that it was true. He was smiling more these days, without even meaning to. Later, after she was asleep, Mark stepped out onto the small balcony. The city stretched out around him, full of noise and light, and people he would never meet. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was standing apart from it all. He felt connected to the kids in the gym, to the neighbors who had started greeting him in the mornings, to his own daughter who was growing up stronger every day. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The man who had sat in silence at the kitchen table, wondering if he had done the right thing, seemed far away now. The man standing here tonight had found something new, not the rush of combat, not the brief satisfaction of putting a bully on the floor, but something deeper, steadier, purpose. The city hummed softly around him, and for once it felt less like a battlefield and more like a home. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.